Part 3. Exile. Sanhome. Horth's first impression of Sanhome was the double embrace of a crisp breeze and Zrenel's bear hug. The breeze made him sneeze. Allergies? Zrenel sympathized with his more Vrelish brother. It'll pass. It did on Tark, remember? Horth's nostrils attempted to pinch closed as he inhaled and his eyes narrowed. The air was peppered with dried leaves, battered to scraps as they tumbled in the wind. Everything was shades of brown, from the overcast sky to the bare, thorny bushes encroaching on the edge of the landing field. Hill was greeted by a Nessak woman with a round face and dressed in a light coat that covered her shapelessly from neck to ankles. "This is my wife, Hestia," Hill introduced her proudly. "Hello, Horth," said Hestia. "I am positively fantasizing a home-cooked dinner," Hill exclaimed, taking his wife's hand, and the two of them set off at a brisk walk for a nearby group of buildings surrounded by a wall. "We're headed for Sarnhaven," said Zrenel. "A haven is a bit like a hearth, except it is held in perpetuity by something the Nessaks call soul right. We don't have those because you have to have priests to do it. The Zerstan, that's the council of priests, keep records of everyone's descent to make sure they know which descendants are eligible, and then perform rituals to determine if a soul is present in a new form. Possessions based on soul rights are pretty stable, because it is hard to get the Zerstan to endorse a challenge. Life rights, on the other hand," Zrenel exclaimed. "Now they're exciting. Men here fight for everything imaginable in the way of property. And," Zrenel added with even more excitement, "I do mean the men. You won't find a Nessak woman on the planet taking fencing lessons or learning how to fly, either. We have that side of things pretty much to ourselves." Horth listened without grasping all the details. The path they walked on was flanked by sculpted shrubs that told stories about evolving shapes, without resorting to the kind of repetition that would disconcert a pilot with good navigational instincts. "Is Horth really only 11? Hestia asked Zrenel as they neared the Sarnhaven enclosure. "It's the Vrelish in him," Zrenel said, sounding awkward. Horth could tell his brother was trying to make a good impression, so he forgave Zrenel just this once. Otherwise, he would have expressed himself with a punch. The wall around the Sarnhaven compound appeared to be for keeping in both domestic animals and the younger children of the settlement. Horth counted about 50 buildings and estimated a population of a few thousand. They crossed the compound to the building that Hill called the Great House, with Hill explaining everything too fast for Horth to follow, interrupting himself only to extend cheery greetings to people they encountered in the courtyard. The front of the great house had a wide porch, but they skirted it to enter by the back door. Inside, Zrenel insisted they stash their swords and clean off their shoes in a mudroom. Hustled along by his companions, Horth dreaded the reception to come, expecting it to be like one on Fountain Court. But his next surprise was a good one. Horth's party merely added themselves to the hubbub of people already in the dining hall. Men were visiting with one another while women put out the dishes and dealt with the children. Even among the children themselves, Horth noted that it was the girls who helped with food preparations and the boys who hindered them by getting underfoot. Zrenel left Horth's side the moment he spotted a particular girl with a large dish of steaming vegetables and offered to take it from her. The girl, whom Zrenel addressed as April, wore a floor-length dress of plain material covered with a full white apron. Her only adornment was confined to the intricate way that her hair was braided, but there was a splash of life about her that made it easy to explain Zrenel's fascination. What puzzled Horth was that the girl needed no help whatsoever. Despite this, she let Zrenel take the dish she was carrying, first blushing and then murmuring her thanks. Acting on Zrenel's example, Horth picked out a stout woman with a sweating face who was carrying a platter with a whole roasted animal on it that was about the size of a Tarkian dog, and wordlessly offered to carry it for her by lifting it out of her hands. The stout woman was surprised, but soon grasped his intentions. "Well," she declared, with her hands on her hips and a wide, beaming smile on her mouth, "who says court Nessaks have no manners?" Horth put the platter of meat down where she directed and straightened up. "Not Nessak," he corrected her. "Nersalian." There was a short, ugly silence, shared by everyone in earshot of his deep voice. Then the stout woman spoke up. Of course you are Nersalian, she told him, as if he had said nothing wrong. And Nersalians are the descendants of Prince Nersal Nessak. Just like I said, Court Nessak. She nodded at the table. Sit down and be welcome here. Horth cast about for Zrenal to help figuring out where to sit, but his brother was far more interested in April than he was in Horth. A lanky girl with large gray eyes and a wide mouth strode up. She wore a dress very much like April's, but her build was thin and muscular instead of plumb and round. More Vrelish, Horth decided. She also smelled like a Vrelish female, though the thrilling odor was heavily subdued by a soapy one. Is it true that you killed a man at court? She asked Horth. Horth shook his head. A woman. Oh, the girl was clearly shocked. Trying to sound worldly, she added. A Vrelish woman, was it? Horth nodded, hoping she would not ask any more about Hara. Perhaps she noticed his discomfort. My name's Kale, she introduced herself. It's a word from the priest books, a plant word with a water element. I think I should have been named for the wind instead, because I don't like water. Do you like to hunt? Horth thought about the afternoon spent with his brothers on Tark. Yes, he told her. Kale lifted her chin towards the roast he had helped the stout woman place on the table. I killed that, she told him. It's a zer pig. Zerhen says the Zerstan changed them just enough so they could thrive on Sanhome and be useful to us. You have to be careful what you eat in the wild except for zer things. Most of it won't kill you, but it can make you sick. Thank you, said Horth, because the warning seemed like useful information. The stout woman with the sweaty face headed for the far end of the table. We'll be starting any minute, Kale said. Horth looked around while he waited, and saw Hill holding court for a trio of half-grown boys who listened wide-eyed. But can women really fight with swords? Asked one boy, his voice standing out as the rest of the room grew quiet. Don't they lose when they go up against men like Zrenal? And don't the men feel stupid about fighting women? Mothers descended to claim their offspring before Hill could respond. At the head of the table, the stout woman took off her apron and took her seat beside two empty places, just as her husband, Liege Sarn, and the family priest entered. Liege Sarn was superficially similar to Horth's uncle Zer Sarn in appearance, but with a less sour and more stately manner. He wore house braid on his semi-formal dinner jacket that echoed elements in Horth's. He was not wearing his sword, but Zrenal had explained back in the mudroom that this was nothing to worry about. The family priest was a chubby man with a friendly face, dressed in a robe. That's Zerhen, Kale whispered. The whole table rose as Liege Sarn and Zerhen took their seats. Unprepared, Horth shot up with a jerk. Across the table, Zrenal winced. I understand we have a new member of the family joining us today, said Zerhen, folding his plump hands together as he gave a nod in Horth's direction. Welcome to Sarn Haven, Horth Nersal. Horth froze, his heart rate elevated, wondering what might be expected of him. But all that happened was that everybody muttered welcome in a perfunctory way that proved they were more interested in dinner. When they all sat down again and prepared for prayers, Horth looked at Zrenal for guidance, but his brother, who was seated beside April, had already lowered his head. Kale took Horth's hands and put them together with the left one cupped in the right, and hissed, For the prayer to the dead ancestors. Then she demonstrated a variation with her own hands, in which the thumbs met in the front at a right angle. For addressing a great soul, she instructed. Horth frowned. He knew all that. Mother had taught him. He also knew that Father did not allow them to indulge in Nessak practices at public receptions. But in the end, he took his clue from Zrenal, who had clearly decided to go native. My thanks to my good wife, and all those who helped her to make our home a haven, Liege Sarn addressed the living, followed by Zerhen, who thanked specific members of the waiting dead for the safe return of Hill and Arn's party before going on to address San Nersal. Bless us with your good will in the bonds we forge here with your children from the house of Nersal in the person of Zrenal and his younger brother, said Zerhen. May their lives among us help to reunite all Nessaks in the sacred cause of husbanding life-supporting places in the universe and defending them against the Okal Ani terror. Blessed life, muttered everyone around the table. Then the mood was broken as the diners dug in. taking food from serving dishes and passing them around. Horth enjoyed the baked zerpig, but could not do justice to the heaps of vegetables, although he tried to eat some. He partook only sparingly of the dessert tray passed around after the main course, eating a couple of things that looked like large raisins and tasted more like dried plums. By the time the meal ended, Horth was feeling mildly nauseous from all the fiber he digested, and thoroughly exhausted from trying to track a dozen conversations at once. Zrenal noticed, at last, and made Horth's excuses to the company. Upstairs, Zrenal showed him around the facilities while briefing him on what he could and could not expect the women of the household to do for him. Nessak women were apparently prepared to act like servants but were not to be approached in any way approximating sexual behavior. Women here aren't Vrelish, Zrenal told Horth. They aren't exactly Demish either. The bottom line is... Zrenal made a fist and held it, big and solid, in front of Horth's nose. If you do anything vulgar to embarrass me, I'll break your face so badly you'll die of regenerative cancer before it heals up. No sex. Got that? Horth frowned. It seemed to him there must be some women on Sanhome, Vrelish or not, who needed men as much as he desired women. What did you think of April? Zrenal asked, grinning like a kid who had just beaten his trainer at a sparring bout. It was a springtime month on Earth, you know, he continued. It's just right for her, he finished enthusiastically. Horth shrugged. Personally, he failed to see what a seasonal variation caused by the axial tilt of an orbiting planet had to do with the silly blushing girl. Oh, what would you know about it, Rejact? Zrenal said, and stalked off. Food became a problem for Horth during his first week on Sanhome, but it wasn't until he actually got sick from overindulging in fruit slices that Zrenal admitted to Mrs. Sarn that his brother had a Vrelish stomach. Horth went down to the kitchen the next day to be greeted by a grinning Kale who shoved her bowl of breakfast fare in his direction. The bowl was full of shredded meat, mixed with lard and flavored with small, dried berries. You're not the only one, Kale told him boldly. Try this. We call it pemmican. While Horth was digging into the pemmican, which would have been a lot like fleet rations if it was pressed into bars and desiccated, Kale fetched him juice and a glass of water. He was in the middle of swallowing the last of the juice when Mrs. Sarn bustled in, smiling benevolently. I see that Kale has been taking care of you, Mrs. Sarn said to Horth. Kale gave her a sideways hug and stayed close, taking her welcome for granted. Kale is the only other Vrelish eater that we have here at Sarnhaven, explained Mrs. Sarn, but we're no less proud of her because of it. She gave Kale a squeeze as the girl detached herself to go claim her share of their breakfast. Mrs. Sarn fixed Horth with a serious look, arms folded over her ample chest. Give me your word of honor, Horth Nersal, that you'll behave as befits a son of Princess Beryl, and you may go hunting with Kale today, just the two of you. Frequently briefed on the question of women by Zrenal, Horth was confident that he knew what was expected of him. I will not have sex with Kale today, he gave his earnest promise, rather proud of getting an entire sentence out, even if she asks. Kale burst out in laughter so severe she doubled over at the waist and held her stomach. Kale, Mrs. Sarn admonished her. The Nessak girl righted herself with an effort. And I swear, she said, with mock gravity, not to ask you. Horth knew when he was being made fun of, but refused to admit his presumptions were unreasonable. Everything about Kale pointed to her being more Vrelish than the rest of the family. She was dressed in trousers today, for example, and her braids were tucked under a tight cap. Off you go, then, Mrs. Sarn said, briskly, and kill us something nice for dinner. So, said Kale, once they were clear of the house and headed off across the Sarnhaven enclosure at a brisk walk. What have you hunted before? Grabbits, he told her, on Tark. You eat those? No, said Horth. Then what do you kill them for? They're pests, he said. They steal from us. Sort of like non-eternals, are they? Kale asked. You leave them alone if they leave you alone, otherwise you clear them out. Horth shrugged. Kale took him to a shed where she gutted her catch and kept her weapons. The only weapons he saw were edged ones and hand-operated bows, but he had expected as much. Only honorable weapons were used on Tark, even against the pesky native grabbits. It was part of the compromise Okal Rel demanded of beings powerful enough to destroy all they depended on for survival, an honorable act of restraint in the conquest of nature that afforded better sport and taught discipline. We Nessacs live in harmony with our environment, Kale boasted. Not like other people in the Empire. Oh, you say you do, I've heard that, she reacted to his look of offended honor. But you don't do it like us. We don't even use Rel batteries, except a little here and there among the warrior families to show off. What's wrong with Rel batteries? Horth asked, finding it as easy to talk to Kale as he did to Branst. As far as he could see, Rel batteries were a perfect energy source, charged as a byproduct of flying with no polluting side effects. Kale sat down on a stool in her bed, with a crossbow on her knees. What do you know about time slip? She asked. Everything, declared Horth. All right then, what causes it? Weak grip, said Horth. No, she said. Not weak, weaker. If no one but you ever reality skimmed, you would have to absorb your own time debt. Instead, the weaker pilots pay the price for you cheating the laws of special relativity. For every pilot who makes dock successfully, someone else has got a time slip. Horth held up one hand and wiggled the fingers. Many, many safe flights, he said, then lowered the first hand and held up the second, balled into a fist. One pilot, infinite time slip. Are you suggesting, Kale said, that it is all right to fly because only a few people have to experience near-infinite time slip to compensate for everyone else? Horth shrugged. The fact remains, Kale insisted, that we are talking about knocking a pilot out of the cycle of birth and death entirely, not simply killing him. So at the very, very least, we should never fly frivolously. Choice, said Horth, having considered this problem himself at length when he learned what happened when you time-slipped. Pilot's risk, pilot's choice. Kale tossed her head. For you, maybe. I will never get to fly because women do not have to do it. It isn't necessary. So I have no right to force time debt on someone who is flying to keep the rest of us safe from Okalani conquerors. She said it so fiercely Horth decided not to argue. Kale got up and banged around the shed getting ready. She found Horth a crossbow and thrust it at him. You know how to use one? He nodded. Good, she said. Don't make a lot of noise stomping through the underbrush after me. For the rest of the afternoon, he learned a lot about moving through brambles and across squishy marshes without startling Zerdir. He also learned how much fun it was to receive a hero's welcome from the women who ran Sarnhaven's kitchens when they came home with dinner. He and Kale did not discuss the ethics of reality skimming again, but they hunted together regularly. Horth got up one morning, months after his arrival, to find the household in a tizzy over the summons from the reigning Kisk. The high seat, where the Kisk held court, was located in a city simply known as the capital, about 2 hours away by light plane. Zrenal and Horth were to present themselves in 10 days. Suddenly, the casual rhythms of work and play ended. There were protocols to learn, statements to memorize, and clothes to choose. It reminded Horth of functions held on Fountain Court. Fortunately, here as there, most of the hard work fell to Zrenal as the oldest brother. Horth and Zrenal flew to the capital, with Hill serving as navigator. He was also to act as their guide within the city once they arrived. Zerhen came along to provide any necessary spiritual guidance. The capital was an ecologically sustainable city of just over 1 million people, planned around a series of pedestrian-only rings with intersecting roads for vehicles. The palace grounds of the High Seat lay at the center, flanked by the campus of the Zer Seminary on one side and the Temple of San on the other. The surrounding town was divided into sections owned by different royal families, like the Sarns, who claimed descent from one of San Nersal's children. The palace itself had a grand facade, used for ceremonial departures and arrivals, but its most prominent feature was the challenge arena bulging out to one side in an open-air amphitheater. Hill set the plane down on the outskirts of the capital at an airport named Zerpol. "What a thing to name an airport," objected Zrenal. "A doomed soul, too weak to fight back." Hill stopped cold and gave Zrenal a blank stare. Then he slapped his knee and laughed. "Is that what you Nersalians think of a Zerpol?" Zrenal frowned. "A Zerpol proves his enemy's Okalani by becoming their victim," he said stubbornly. "I'd say that's an unlucky name for any dock, even if it is only for atmospheric aircraft." Zerhen cleared his throat and spoke up. "Ah, but the thing is, you see, why does the sacrifice have such an impact? It's because the Zerpol is loved for exemplifying the pole virtues, such as cooperation and trust. So you see, Zerpol is quite an appropriate name for a shared resource." "Don't tell me any more," Zrenal groaned. "It is starting to sound like one of Zersarn's lectures on the mysteries and errors." Horth noticed fellow travelers pause to look at him and Zrenal. Sometimes parents even pointed them out to their children. But, on the whole, he felt sure that grandsons of the ruling Ava would have commanded more attention on Gillian than he and Zrenal did on San Home, which was puzzling given the books Keen had brought to Gillian. A short drive in a hired car saw them to their lodgings at a place called an away house in the Sarn sector that was built around a large internal courtyard. It had 8 suites, each with an external dining area arranged so residents could take in what was happening on the central exercise floor. A sort of gymnastic dance was taking place in the courtyard when they arrived, but Horth knew better than to imagine any of the women performing barefoot in long swishing skirts would be available. He had already learned that Nessacs performed for each other rather than delegating that role to courtesans. The next morning, Horth, Zrenal, Hill, and Zerhen were picked up by a car and driven to the Kisk Palace along one of the radial roads. They got out at the grand entrance glimpsed from the air the day before, and passed up a long hall with a high ceiling that was lined with guards of honor who presented their swords in a ritual gesture as they passed. Horth thought the guards looked odd, because they were dressed in nothing but fighting trunks and sashes that displayed their house braids and colors. The Kisk himself wore a heavy mantle of fur and leather over a costume very much like that of the semi-naked honor guards in the hall. Horth thought the Kisk had a brash air of youth and reckless arrogance about him for a grandfather, despite the ageless appearance of highborns, or as Nessacs preferred to call them, Eternals. They did not stay long in the Kisk's presence, and nothing was said beyond the phrases Zrenal had rehearsed at Sarn Haven. Horth found the whole affair worse than a demish reception. It was on the way out of the audience chamber that he learned something valuable. "I'm glad that's done," huffed Zerhen, brushing down his robes to dislodge crumbs of pastries he had sampled while waiting in a side chamber. "It could have been worse," Hill agreed. "The high seat has passed between the Ko and Sarn lines so often, Kisk Ko can't help but view Zrenal as a title contender, especially when there are Zer factions trying to revive the business of Beryl's children being conduits for the San soul. That sort of thing is bound to attract trouble." "Indeed," Zerhen said with a relieved sigh. "But not this time." "What do you mean, the Ko and Sarn lines?" asked Zrenal. "Isn't the reigning Kisk a Sarn? I mean, he is my grandfather." "Technically," said Zerhen, with a sigh of disappointment for humanity. "But biology will out, as the saying goes." Zrenal stopped cold 6 meters short of the outside doors. The rest of the party swung about him in a loose pinwheel. "Technically," Zrenal bellowed. "What do you mean he's technically my grandfather?" Hill looked nervous. "Zrenal, please, not here. I'll explain it to you on the way home." "You'll explain it now," demanded Zrenal. "All right," Hill snapped, casting a self-conscious glance at the stone-still guards of honor. "You were the son of Beryl Nessac, and she is a Kisk child, but that was under a different Kisk. The title has changed hands since then, lots of times. A Kisk has to defend a title a lot more often than your father does. If he didn't, the whole system would break down." Zrenal looked thunderstruck. "Look, Zrenal," Hill said, putting an arm around the young Nersalian's back. "It doesn't matter if you are descended from a live Kisk or a dead one. You are just as entitled to call yourself a Nessac prince and challenge for the high seat if you want." That's why any reigning Kisk calls new contenders to the capital, to get a look at them. What makes it all the more complex in your case, Zerhen added, is the business of your mother being married to your father to attract important souls back into her line. There was a Sarn in the high seat, you see, when that was done. And there are sympathizers in the Zerstan who think that you, or your descendants, ought to be Kisk, even now. Politics, you know, he smiled. But let's get back to our rooms and order dinner. I think that would be the best thing just now. Zrenal was sullen all the way back to the away house. I don't know what you are so upset about, Hill told him in exasperation. You are still every bit as much the grandson of the Kisk as you would be if the man you met today had been your mother's sire. That's how it works on Sanhome. That isn't how it works on Fountain Court, Zrenal fired back. Horth said nothing. Ever since Zerhen used the word politics, he knew that he wasn't going to understand. Just be grateful nothing went wrong, Hill urged Zrenal. But something had. A dashing Nessak prince was waiting for them in the courtyard of the Sarn away house. They came across him, chatting with a knot of admirers. He extracted himself from his fans when he spotted his quarry and bounded over to introduce himself. Zrenal Nersal? He asked Zrenal, offering an arm to grasp. I am Prince Corin of Family Sarn, your Uncle Keen's son. Zrenal took the offered arm of friendship with hesitance. Akrel, he said in a wary tone. Akrel, Corin agreed. May the dead be proud. Hill looked excited. Zerhen looked worried, which, together with the celebrity attention Corin was receiving in the courtyard, suggested he was well known as a swordsman. I am afraid, Corin said, that you and Horth have been invited to a sporting melee by 4 of the Kisk relatives. I took the liberty of telling them I would deliver the challenge card. Corin produced it with a flourish and handed it to Zrenal, who scanned it quickly before letting Hill take it from his hand. Enard Ko, Hill read, looking paler. That's bad. What's a sporting melee? Zrenal wanted to know. Is it some kind of tournament like the Pandemish Games on Gillian? I'm afraid that ours have rather more fatalities, said Corin. He was dressed in a layered mauve cloak, with a complex knot of tied scarves at his throat. But apart from his dandified clothing, Corin reminded Horth strongly of Keen in the way he conducted himself with quiet courage and an understated confidence. Shall we eat while we discuss it? Asked Prince Corin with a nod towards the dining area on the lip of the courtyard. Hill exclaimed too loudly, Yes, sure! He was still visibly shaken by the challenge card, but seemed equally determined to impress its bearer. Once the men had settled around the table, a trio of women attached to the away house came to wait upon them. Not too much wine, Corin warned the others as the drinks were being delivered. Not if you fight tomorrow. Tomorrow seems a bit rushed, said Zerhen. Corin shrugged. The woman who brought the wine settled on a garden seat nearby and was soon joined by 2 of the dancers from the night before. Emboldened by the women's example, other guests began to drift in and coalesce around the table to hear more about the proposed melee. The thickening audience had a pronounced effect on Hill's and Zrenal's behavior. Hill made more efforts to repress his nervousness, and Zrenal tried not to seem stupid when he didn't know how things worked on Sanhome. He tended to accept Corin's lead wherever possible. Corin spent most of the meal telling them about the 4 men who had issued the challenge. They seemed to fight a lot of duels, Zrenal observed, awkwardly, in a pause. Corin nodded. Enard Ko and his team are the Kisk's main sweepers in the capital. Horth knew what sweepers meant in a space war. They were the members of an Avshah's hand who ran interference whenever the Avshah, who was usually the stronger flyer, was going for a prime target. Melees are typically fought in 4s, Corin explained to Zrenal, but they are really between the 2 principals in this case, Enard and Zrenal. Why? Horth interjected like a sword thrust. What was being proposed sounded dangerous. He didn't understand why Hill and Zrenal seemed so willing to entertain the idea. Corin answered with patient forbearance. I know you are only 11, Horth, no matter how grown up you appear. He looked to Zrenal for guidance. I'll tell him, said Zrenal, emboldened by the audience collecting around their table as the excitement built up. On the challenge card, Anard Ko claims it is a false hope to expect my blood to be rel enough for the Sand Soul to be reborn into our line through my children. He wants me to renounce any claim to that pretension and go back home to Gileon. Anard doesn't think you've got enough experience to realize what you're giving up if you back down, Corin coached Zrenal. Nor else he thinks he won't be able to raise a good team on short notice. He did this now on purpose, before you have established a reputation. Zrenal shoved away his unfinished plate, too worked up to eat any more. What happens if I decline the challenge? If he wants to remain current, a contender must accept any challenge over grounds that lack ununanimous consensus by the Zerstan, said Corin. That's what I meant when I said Anard Ko is a sweeper. However unfair it seems, declining his challenge will cost you the right to contend for the high seat, now or ever. And that only means one less threat to the Kisk, his cousin. Zrenal held his breath a moment, then let it out in a whoosh, as if he had been winded. Horth was equally hard hit, but for different reasons. He'd had no idea until that moment that his brother had any designs in the high seat. Kisk Ko had not impressed Horth at all. Why be Kisk? Horth asked Zrenal, surprised at the force behind his question. Why be Kisk? Hill exclaimed and slapped his knee. The gesture broke the tension around the table. Women blushed, and all the men in earshot laughed uproariously. Why be Kisk? Exclaimed a kibitzer. For the glory! For the women, said another man, and they all broke out again in choppy laughter. Grinning like an idiot, Hill leaned towards Horth to explain it to him. The Kisk can marry any woman he wants, and she has to have him. Nor can she marry again if she's widowed. She becomes a priestess of the temple and remains the bride of the next Kisk. Although only children conceived during her husband's reign can call themselves princes and princesses. Children like your mother, Beryl, and Corin's father, Keen. You never have to sleep alone if you were Kisk, another man summarized. He's commander-in-chief of the fleet, someone else mentioned, with many privileges within his gift. People flock to see him when he goes on tour, said someone else. And with the right kind of family support, the first spectator concluded, you can last for years. Family like Anard Ko's, unfortunately. Prince Corin reclaimed the floor. It's up to you, Zrenal. I'm here to help you if you want me to fight on your team. Your father killed mine, but it was done with honor. Keen himself would expect me to extend my arm in friendship to his sister's firstborn. Zrenal looked pale for the first time, as if the gravity of what he was deciding had finally sunk in past the buzz of excitement and touched him in a place where he was mortal. He wet his lips. I could refuse? Asked Zrenal. Corin nodded. Yes, and go home. I doubt the Sarns would want to offer you a place here if you relinquished the claim that makes you royalty. Not to mention failing to defend your role in Zersis Okal's prophecy. Zrenal's jaw muscles worked. I don't know. Corin smiled. Of course, Anard and his pack of bullies are not amateurs. The fight is meant to be to first blood, but I'll be surprised if someone doesn't die in this one. You, if Anard can arrange it. It isn't right to bait you like this, if you ask me, when you're here alone except for an 11-year-old brother. And me, Hill volunteered suddenly, springing up from the bench where he was seated. His face was burning with excitement. I'll stand with you on behalf of Sarnhaven. Good, Corin said, nodding. But that still only makes 3 warriors. Don't count Horth out, Zrenal said. He may only be 11, but he's a natural with a sword. The endorsement stirred something profoundly irrational in Horth. He still didn't see why Zrenal would want to be Kisk, except for maybe the bit about the fleet. Women, he still believed, had to be attainable in less prescribed ways. But he was vulnerable to the compliment of being valued by Zrenal, despite his age and verbal disability. San herself, Hill exclaimed, drawing his own sword with an exhilarating swish and turning it around to bring the pommel down on the table with a bang. Let's show House Co what we Sarns are made of. The next thing Horth knew, the rest of them had drawn their own swords and copied Hill's gesture in unison. The sound of the bangs, confirming fellowship, sent a thrill through him. Only Zerhen muttered unhappily to himself as the evening turned into a celebration of Zrenal's acceptance. The next morning found the team up early, getting ready to go. Corin set the standard for courage with a cheerful, optimistic attitude. Hill talked Zerhen out of sending word back to Sarnhaven. Wise decision, Corin told Hill. I never tell my wife about a duel. I suppose, Zerhen fretted. I still wonder what sort of sense it all makes. Okal limits conflicts to the human scale to spare environments, of course. But the number of young men in royal families who do each other injuries because the Zerstan can't agree about things. Don't worry, Zer, promised Corin. I will do what I can to make sure you take all of your Sarnhaven flock home again. No one wanted to admit he was scared. Instead, there was so much one-upmanship going on that Horth found it impossible to warm up properly in the courtyard. He was afraid he might forget that they were only practicing if someone pushed him too hard. Finally, the four of them made their last farewells to a crowd of well-wishers, who were either friends of Hill's, fans of Corin's, or simply the enemies of Family Co. Horth was grateful for the silence as they climbed into Corin's waiting car. A mob received them outside the Kisk's palace. People lined the street and had to be held back from the doors they had passed so uneventfully the day before. A holiday atmosphere prevailed despite the gravity of what was going on. Corin's popular in Anard isn't, Hill explained, as an attendant directed them down a new passage. The stands will be full. Their destination was a lavish dressing room replete with a wide selection of gear, walk-in showers, and observers acting as guards of honor. They even had their own first aid attendant, a low-ranking Zer, who wore a badge licensing him to practice a limited range of medical arts without giving offense to the watching dead. All right, Corin told them heartily. Let's suit up. It's supposed to be the First Blood, so everyone wears armor. Protection certainly made sense. But Horth had never fought a serious match with a fencing mask obstructing his vision before. You need to wear it, Horth, insisted Zrenal. Horth scowled. By all the mad gods of Earth, Zrenal exploded, snatching the mask from the attendant and thrusting it at his recalcitrant brother. Put it on! No, Horth declined, afraid of being hindered. Too much of his style was sheer instinct. He was afraid the mask would interfere. Hill weighed in with arguments, but words were powerless against Horth's qualms. Time pressed, and Zrenal had to give in before very long. He went off to get himself prepared instead, muttering the whole time about how it wouldn't be his fault if the reject got himself killed. We'll put him between us, Prince Corin said. That should make it easier to see he doesn't get hit. Horth was willing to accept that, if it made Zrenal stop fussing about the hated mask, which he now felt superstitiously certain was bound to foul him up if he wore it. He was happier with the padded fencing jacket that the attendant urged on him, except the man felt driven by Horth's silence to presume he needed lecturing. The goal with a challenge to First Blood, the attendant said, is to nick exposed arms or legs. Your torso is protected by 2 slash-resistant layers, with a stiffer lining underneath to stop a lunge. Horth tried the jacket on, deciding it was worth the effort to adjusting it, then turned to the attendant who had put one on himself to model how it should be fastened. You see, the attendant said as he straightened up and tapped his middle once. Perfectly safe now. Horth tested the man's hypothesis with a jab. He picked a non-lethal target on the right side of the attendant's ribcage, and he didn't drive as hard as he could, but the Nessak still went down with a surprised squawk, arms windmilling and eyes popping out of his head. What was that for? Exclaimed the second attendant, rushing over to help his fallen comrade. Horth shrugged. If the Nessak had lied about the jacket's properties, he would have deserved what he got. As it turned out, he had told the truth, and Horth knew more about the body armor than he had before. His sword had torn the top 2 layers of the fencing jacket. The bottom one deflected the thrust. He also knew how his own sword would feel when striking someone else's jacket, and that there was a risk of it getting caught in the top layer of slash-resistant cloth. "This way," Corin said when they were all dressed, and led them to a chamber filled with 5 man-sized tubes. "This is how we get fielded when the time comes," said Corin. "Each of us gets into one of those. There is a lift at the bottom. It goes up at a smart pace, but is very smooth. There will be nothing around you when you get to the top. But don't step off before it stops, or you'll disqualify yourself from making a false start. Once you're flush with the arena floor, wait for a buzzer to sound. That's the signal for the melee to start. Never mind what's happening in the stands. The audience can't hurt you, only the other side can. Size up the opposition, by all means, while you're waiting for the buzzer. Enard is tallest and prefers the central position. He plays his cousins Charles and Devon on either side and his Borello, Mason, on his left side. They're all right-handed like us, except for Horth. Any questions?" No one spoke. Corin showed them how to hold their swords, pointing down with the grip in both hands before they stepped into the fielding tubes. Horth was assigned to the far right at the last minute, despite the earlier agreement to put him between Corin and Zrenal, because Zrenal pointed out that the strongest opponents on the opposing team were the 2 in the middle, Enard and his best friend, Mason. "Remember," Hill told Horth for the 4th time as they waited for the lifts to start, "you're out of it as soon as someone bloodies you. Hits made after that cost us the match." "They're ready for you now," said the attendant, and the lifts began to rise through the floor. Despite Corin's advice to the contrary, Horth took note of his surroundings on the way up, but the crowd in the open-air amphitheater did not interest him very much. Nor did the boxes occupied by the Kisk and relatives of the Zerstan. Instead, he took note of the state of the sky, including the position of the sun. There was sufficient cloud cover to mute Sanhome's yellow star without being heavily overcast, which was more or less ideal weather for a duel. Horth was reassured by the fact, since he was much more comfortable fighting under indoor conditions. The floor of the theater was covered in short green grass. He did not like that, in case the ground cover proved slippery. The grass looked dry, but he couldn't be sure. When the lift stopped, he tested it with the bottom of his fitted shoe. "Horth!" Zrenal hissed beside him. "Don't move!" Fortunately, testing the grass did not constitute a false start, because no one ordered Horth disqualified for the move. Horth took a quick note at the judges lining either side of the field, the tracking cameras mounted discreetly on the sidelines, and the sense of expectation in the stands. Then, he gave his full attention to the opposition's lineup. Enard's team were dressed in the same masks and body armor as Zrenal's, except for Horth's omission of the standard mask. As the challenging team, they wore black, while white was traditional in Sanhome for defenders. Hill had explained all that at some point in the endless talk the night before, and it somehow made Horth feel things were under control to see that it was true. The presiding judge of honor read out the nature of the challenge and the names of the 8 participants, while Horth continued his examination. He could not make out the faces well behind the masks, but he had an eye for body language. He saw Mason notice his own head was exposed. Mason turned to say something to the man named Devon on the end of the line opposite Horth. The judge of honor finished. He stepped off the field. A buzzer signaled it was time to start. Zrenal, Hill, and Corin had discussed strategy in a melee half the night and again during practice this morning. None of it seemed to apply now. Both lines charged toward each other. Horth's opponent, Devon, was primed to go for Horth's exposed head. Horth decided to let him, trusting he would not get fancy if he thought he had a clear shot. Horth targeted Mason's calf instead, while Enard's Borello was busy blocking Zrenal's attack. As Devon's blade went for Horth's exposed throat, Horth dropped to one knee and slashed Mason's leg near the ankle. It was more awkward than he liked, and his footing did slip slightly on the grass. but the utterly astonished yelp from Mason was its own reward. Unfortunately, Horth had too much to worry about to congratulate himself for being the first on either team to draw blood. If Devon recovered too fast, or Mason didn't stick to the rules, he was going to find himself in an extremely bad position. Horth had to trust Zrenal to keep Mason occupied if the Nessak decided killing Horth would be worth the forfeit, because Devon was as much as he could cope with right now. Left knee down, Horth had to throw his weight right, very hard, to knock Devon's feet out from under him. There was more luck than he liked in the success of the maneuver, coupled with Devon's almost clownish surprise at his young opponent's novel moves. Devon toppled right, still without so much as a scratch. Mason, however, stayed down, too clearly bloodied in the leg to hope it might escape notice. He crawled a meter clear of the struggle before hobbling up and getting help from observers to make it the rest of the way off. Horth scrambled up the far side of the enemy line, met Devon's charge, and managed to block it. Momentum drove them together, so close Horth could see the other man's angry face through the fine mesh of his mask. They maintained that way for a space of a breath, before Horth got himself braced well enough to hurl the Nessak back. In the respite gained, Horth saw that Hill was bleeding from a wound in his upper arm while his opponent, Charl, was helping Enard gang up on Corin. That left Zrenal the choice of helping either Horth or Keen's son. Horth grinned a confidence he didn't quite feel at his brother, and left Zrenal to draw Enard's attack. Each side had lost one man, so they were still able to match up one-on-one. "Kill the Vrelagerer!" Mason shouted at Devon from the sidelines as he and Horth sized each other up. Horth charged, unable to contain himself anymore. He drove Devon back towards Zrenal and Enard, but this time with Devon on their side of the line. Enard realized the danger of Horth coming in from behind and fell back, leading Zrenal on. Suddenly, Enard switched partners, shouting something to Devon as he turned to attack Horth. Devon obediently turned his attention to Zrenal, but Zrenal refused to be drawn and blocked Enard's slash at Horth's head that might have lost him an eye. The save cost Zrenal his game, though, when Devon impaled him in the upper arm. Devon tried to drive his sword in farther, through the opening in Zrenal's jacket, but he didn't get the time. Horth repaid his brother by driving the successful Nessak off. But they had lost Zrenal, and were one man short. In the next few seconds, Corn wounded Charl, and Enard caught Corn in the arm. Suddenly, it was just Horth against both Devon and Enard. Already in the grip of two attendants, Zrenal shouted, "Take a safe hit and live, damn you, Rejact!" Zrenal meant well, Horth was sure, but his brother's attempt to advise him seemed ludicrous under the circumstances, because it would require his opponent's cooperation, and neither Enard nor Devon struck him as interested in letting him survive this fight. He knew that was serious, but it was also no more nor less than one piece of the puzzle that he had to solve. Enard smiled. Then he lunged, or pretended to. Horth was almost irretrievably committed to defensive action when he realized he'd been fooled, and fell back as fast as he could. He learned something vital in that moment, because Devon had a chance to go for a flesh wound, but did not. Devon wanted him dead. Horth could use that information. Balance recovered, Horth engaged Enard in a dance that kept them both busy blocking each other and maneuvering for position. Horth made a point of keeping Devon on the far side of Enard, working for the perfect alignment of both Nessaks. He was beginning to doubt he could keep it up when he saw what he wanted, at last. Horth offered Devon a headshot, a fatal one. Devon went for it with an abandon that was all that Horth had hoped for. He deflected the lunge into Enard's chest, knowing the Nessak team captain wasn't too worried about protecting himself there, because of his armor. Devon's sword cut the top layers of Enard's jacket at an oblique angle and snagged for an instant. In that moment, Horth closed with Enard, driving the right-handed fencer's sword clear with his left-handed attack and punching out as hard as he could with the heel of his right hand. His hand hurt where he hit Enard's mask, as Horth knew it would, but he kept nothing back. The Nessak's head snapped backwards. The cloth at the rear of the mask did not offer enough resistance to stop it from going farther than it should, and Horth had calculated well for maximum leverage. Enard's neck broke. Devon had his sword clear by the time Enard began to fall. Horth ducked and swept his own sword back to block. The exchange was fast and furious after that, one-on-one, but without distractions, Devon was no match for the genius of Horth's instinctive anticipation of everything Devon was about to do. The fight lasted 4 minutes, only because Horth wanted more than first blood, in payment for Devon's own intentions, but the Nessac's body armor and mask offered few lethal targets. As his anger abated, Horth gave up and settled for slicing Devon's forearm. Horth sprang clear. Devon lost control and charged him anyway with an enraged shout. Horth blocked, and in seconds, 2 burly guards of honor were wrestling Devon to the ground, not only disqualified, but guilty of dishonoring his cause. All at once, like a single mad being with 1,000 mouths, the crowd roared. Horth was so alarmed he nearly dropped his sword. He had no time to make social mistakes after that, though, because his team rushed back onto the field, some of them still bleeding, and others wearing evidence of first aid attentions. Zrenal was hurt the worst, but still couldn't get in enough hugs. "That was brilliant, Reject! Brilliant!" Horth's brother kept exclaiming as he pounded Horth on the back. Corrin's congratulations were equally hearty, but quieter. Hill had lost a lot of blood and had to sit down. Horth began to feel the pain in his right hand, where he'd used it to hit Enard, and kept testing it to confirm it still worked properly. In the end, Corrin had to support Hill as they retraced their steps, out of the arena, along the hall lined with guards of honor, and into the hordes of screaming fans who struck Horth as raving mad. A whole troop of Nessacs were necessary just to make it possible for the 4 of them to get back into Corrin's waiting car. Progress along the road back to the away house was numbingly slow. Corrin and Zrenal waved to the people out the windows as they talked in loud, excited voices about everything they had done right and wrong. Even Hill came around and managed to enjoy it all. Horth sat in the back seat, dumbstruck by the pressing crowd that shouted his name so loudly he could feel the vibration through the car door. He nearly panicked more than once, irrationally sure they would claw their way in with their bare hands. All he wanted to do when they reached the away house was to hide in his room. He stayed there the rest of the night, refusing to be dragged out to share in the rowdy celebration taking place in the courtyard. He was grateful to Zrenal for defending his right to be left alone. One morning, weeks after the fight at the Capitol, while Kale and Horth were out running, Horth found himself struggling with the promise he had given Mrs. Sarn. Sex was on his mind constantly whenever Kale was around. He was certain she felt the same way, but they had both sworn to behave themselves. So, they exercised. A lot. Much to Horth's disgust, he discovered that arousal hindered him more than it did her, so on top of everything else, she beat him more often than she should. That was why Kale made the crest of a gentle hill ahead of Horth and stood waiting there for him, looking down over a machine yard full of harvesters. "Look," she said as Horth caught up. "There's their hen." Horth caught his breath within seconds, but had to give himself a shake, like a farm dog, in the hope that it might sort out his other problem. It didn't, but he was getting used to that. Trying to ignore the song Kale's very presence sang in his blood, he looked where she pointed. Sure enough, the back end of the chubby priest of Sarn Haven was sticking out the side of a harvester. Horth had seen machines like harvesters chewing their way across ripe fields all fall, reaping and processing Zer barley. A year ago, he would have been interested. Instead, he turned his head to look at the girl beside him. Kale's chin was tipped up slightly, eyes narrowed against the wind and nostrils sipping the scents on it, which were sure to include Horth as well as the smell of hot metal and old grease from the machine yard below. Kale smelled female, The April smell that Zrenal liked to eulogize was more soap than woman in Horth's opinion. The wind changed with a capricious flicker, delivering Kale's scent to Horth's nose with the impact of a body-piercing stab that utterly murdered his willpower. The next thing he knew, he had turned and planted himself in front of her, 1 foot between hers. Kale caught her breath, her braids whipping about her face. Her lips parted. Horth pulled her close to him. The kiss went deep. Her body shuddered, as intensely lost as he was. When she started to panic, she had to wedge both her hands between them and shove hard. They separated with a gasp, Kale looking at him wide-eyed and overcome. Then she seized his hand and tugged him down the slope towards Zerhen at a run. Horth stumbled on the first step, crippled by his fierce arousal, but the movement helped calm him down. He clenched Kale's hand in return, and ran down the hill with her straight to the priest with his torso stuck into the side of a harvester. "Zerhen!" Kale all but screamed, still gripping Horth's hand as if she might time-slip if she let go. The priest backed out of the harvester, grunted when he bumped his head, and blinked at them, his thick forehead smeared in streaks of grime exactly the width of his thick fingers. Horth noticed the power tool in Zerhen's hand as he set it down. It had a worn and serviceable look, with at least 6 heads that could be selected via a dial. At the moment, the protruding tool was a welding gun, and a hot metal tang lingered on the air, strong enough to leave a taste in Horth's mouth. "Ah," said Hen, taking stock of his petitioners with a worried look. "Is it too late to do anything except set a date for the wedding then?" Kale let go of Horth's hand very suddenly. "No," she cried. "We haven't. I know I have the red blood, but I am not like that." The priest laid a hand on her arm. "There is no shame in desire itself, child," he told her. Kale looked at the marks his greasy fingers had made on the sleeve of her white shirt. The priest withdrew the hand apologetically. "All the same," he said, "perhaps you two should think of getting betrothed." The betrothal was announced the next day, after dinner. Horth stood rooted with his will locked on maintaining self-control. Kale remained a safe distance away from him, surrounded by women. She had become strangely brittle since their kiss, and would not repeat the experiment. He had spent half the day running, trying to wear himself out, and the other half working with Zerhen on harvesters. "I don't know if marriage is a good idea for Horth," Zrenal voiced the sole dissenting argument. "He is awfully young." "Kale's only 15 herself," said Zerhen. "But it is no use imagining that they will wait for days, let alone years. It's the Vrelish blood. All you have to do is look at them to see that." All 20 adults in the room did exactly that, making Horth's ears burn with embarrassment as hotly as the rest of him burned with overwhelming lust. "How long do you think they can be kept apart?" Zerhen asked. Kale kept her eyes on the floor with fierce determination until April giggled. Then she burst into action, seizing a pillow off the couch and hurling it at the more demish-looking girl with such force that April let out a yelp and sat down suddenly on a couch. Zrenal sprang to April's side to stand guard. "As I said," Zerhen began, trailing off as Kale bolted out the door. Horth let her go. It was better when she wasn't in the room, although he found, to his great consternation, that the feelings she inspired spilled over into his perception of other women, from stout Mrs. Sarn to Zrenal's girlish April. He had admitted that problem to Zerhen, and been reassured it was too common a problem for men to preclude marriage. "A betrothal it is, then," said Zerhen when the murmur caused by Kale's departure died down. Zrenal looked up from the couch where he sat sheltering April in one large arm. "Is that what you want, Horth?" Horth cleared his throat and replied in a voice like rumbling gravel. "I think so." Betrothal, however, did nothing to help with his immediate problem. Zerhen recommended cold baths. The whole family conspired to keep Horth and Kale apart while arrangements for the wedding were in motion. Zrenal made a trip to court to tell their parents and returned with the news that Beryl was again carrying a child. "Brant says hi," Zrenal added begrudgingly, and don't marry a Nessak. Horth also learned his father had been challenged once since Horth left court. Liege Brillet had dueled twice herself to damp out objections to her steadfast support. Mother is a bit worried about you picking a wife as Vrelish as Kale. Zrenal returned to the subject of Horth's betrothal and clapped his brother on the back. But I talked her up for you. Mother will cope. Father? Horth asked. He said it's your rel, replied Zrenal. Horth would have liked a clearer endorsement than the simple recognition that life could offer hard choices, and more than one path might be followed with honor. As a blessing, it was equal parts warming and respectful acknowledge of Horth's adulthood. It meant too little, and it meant too much. Mother approves, Horth repeated, to be sure. On the whole, absolutely, said Zrenal. Horth fell silent, trying to extract a stronger sense of confidence from the fact. He was glad his mother was pregnant. But the idea of a fourth child, growing up at Black Hearth without them, felt wrong. He felt they ought to be together, somehow. Arn arrived 8 days before the wedding with another member of his fighter hand, named Rad. But it wasn't the wedding they had come for. Something else was afoot, something deeply exciting to every member of Sarn Haven. Arn spent 20 minutes closeted with Liege Sarn before Zerhen was sent for, while rumors spread throughout the house that Arn was there to raise a fighter hand for a raid. Then word came down for Hill and Zrenal to go up. Horth was not invited, and it made him restless. He was surprised when he ran into Kale at the bottom of the stairs, outside the kitchen. They both froze. Then Kale said, Arn is going to take a station called Eagle Nest in Red Reach, near the Sandhome Jump. He has a writ from the Zerstan, saying Liege Kai of Eagle Nest has dropped the Shield of Honor. Horth's eyebrows contracted at this grave accusation, which stripped the offender of the right to recourse under sword law. How? He asked, in his deep voice. I don't know, she said impatiently. I'm a woman. I'm not allowed into a council of war. Within the Ava's empire, it was Fountain Court that took care of punishing Okal behavior. Horth had no idea how Nessaks coped, but it was immediately vital to him that he find out. Kale bristled with the same drive to take action. They're meeting in the men's retiring room upstairs, she told Horth, and bit her lip to stop herself from saying anything more. Horth took the steps in bounds. He went through the door to the retiring room without thinking and was stopped cold by 4 pairs of eyes. He recognized Arn, Hill, and Zrenal. The 4th man had to be the Rel Shah named Rad. Zerhen was in the room too, but he did not look like he belonged. Not Horth, he said at once. He's too young. His body, perhaps, said Arn. He shouldered past the others to look Horth over in a calculating manner. But from what I hear, he has a warrior's soul. What do you think? He asked Zrenal. Can your brother fly as well as he can use a sword? Horth is not a Rel Shah, said Zrenal. He's never flown combat. Horth could see that Zrenal was excited. If he felt protective of him, Horth understood. He felt protective towards Zrenal, too. But the price of turning a blind eye to those who dropped the Shield of Honor meant the end of sword law. Horth was aching to go. Will you vouch for his honor? Arn asked Zrenal. Zrenal bristled. Of course, he's my brother. What do you say, Rad? Arn asked the 4th man. The Rel Shah walked around Horth like a dominant farm dog, on Tark, inspecting a new pup. All right, he said at last. But we leave within the hour, or we won't be sure of catching the enemy vulnerable. He turned to Zerhen, where the plump priest sat frowning over an official-looking document on his lap. Well, Zer? Rad asked. Will you bless us or not? I suppose I must, Zerhen said, fingers mumbling over the piece of 5-sided white vellum bearing the seals and devices of 3 of the Zerstan's 5 orders. Strictly speaking, a majority is all that's needed, of course. Eagle Nest is held by a female liege named Kai. Zrenal told Horth in a breathless voice. She takes in Nessak defectors, especially women like your Kale with a strong dash of Relish blood. But this time, it was Arn's son, Cobalt. And she's had his child. He glanced over his shoulder in Arn's direction, but the Nessak hand leader betrayed nothing but a cold resolve. It's a case of soul theft, Zrenal concluded with vehemence. Arn could wind up Relish in a future incarnation if he doesn't get that baby back from Kai. Horth waited for the rest of it, since Arn's grievance so far seemed to be more against his son for being too lax with his favors than with Liege Kai. No more appeared to be forthcoming, however, which led Horth to a horrible conclusion. Man rape? Horth asked, and was met with a stir of agitation. Hill laughed, Arn stiffened, and the Relshaw named Rad looked personally insulted. Zerhen touched his lips with a nervous hand, muttering, "Oh my," between his fingers. Zrenal put his hand over his eyes in a gesture of terminal embarrassment. Arn snatched the 5-sided document out of Zerhen's hands and held it up. The point is, he told Horth, that Liege Kai has dropped the Shield of Honor, as proved by this document. Warriors do not question what the Zerstan chooses to endorse. Unfortunately, Rad said in a clipped, economical fashion, it is not that easy to take a station away from Vrelish highborns. Kai normally keeps at least one highborn wardship out, with others ready to space at the first alarm. But we have an ally inside, said Arn. A Nessak woman who regrets her decision to be Vrelish. We know that Kai has taken her clan off station to help her woo a new ally into becoming her McCanst. The Vrelish do these things with orgies. That's why she's taken all her highborns, leaving Eagle Nest vulnerable. On the other hand, if she wins her new ally, she'll be twice as hard to get at. Especially without inviting other members of the family to come along and share the spoils, Hill added, as if that was a good joke. Enough talk, cried Rad. We have to go now, or miss our chance. Agreed, said Arn with a nod. We leave in 15 minutes. Bring rations with you, since we may not be able to trust any food that the stationers leave for us. Let's go, cried Hill, shooting up. They were all on their feet and astir within seconds. Zrenal looked anxious. What is it, Nursal? Arn asked. Neither Horth nor I have a freedom price, Zrenal confessed, chagrined. Ach, said Zerhen, brightening now that he had something in hand that he could lecture on with confidence. The need for a freedom price is nothing but a Vrelish superstition. We have a way to deal with it here on Sanhome. Suppose Horth, for example, was killed. Kale, as is intended, could still bear his child via the right of priestly possession. All that's essential is that there be a woman designated whom the newly dead soul would naturally be drawn to desire, since the soul must make a dreadful effort to possess the priest assigned to lie with her. Zrenal was shocked. You mean you would make April pregnant in my place if I died? He cried. Zerhen flushed and waved a pudgy hand. Not me, no, of course not. Ordinary Zers are celibate. Priest possession is a very potent ritual. Only the most holy Zers can do that. Childless or not, we are proud to fly with you, Zrenal, son of Nursal, Prince of Nessak, Arn summed up. Zrenal had to master his emotions. And I with you, Arn, Prince of the Royal House of Sarn. The two men embraced each other. Zerhen got teary as he looked on. Horth met Rad's stare, apparently by accident, but it was not camaraderie that Horth felt from that quarter. He suspected that Rad had his doubts about including the Nursalian brothers, doubts that Horth meant to prove wrong. He and Zrenal were as good as any Nessak Relshahs. 15 minutes, Arn reminded his warriors as they broke up. Horth! Zrenal stopped his brother in the hall as the rest went past. We have a special role to play, said Zrenal. A role that makes us valuable. Just follow my lead, do you understand? Horth nodded. That's the spirit, said Zrenal. Then he dashed away down the hall, no doubt looking for April. Remembering what Arn had said about rations, Horth headed for the kitchen to collect food. He had actually forgotten all about Kale when he found her waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The kitchen was deserted. The big stone table where the women made bread and pastries wiped clean, and the walk-in pantry at the back swallowed in darkness like an open mouth. "Are you flying with them?" Kale asked, her face aglow. Horth nodded, and then, to prove he could speak, rumbled, "Yes." Kale swallowed. She wanted to be going with him so badly it was palpable. Instead, she threw herself into Horth's arms. "I want you," she said, her voice rough with desire. "Now, before you leave, in case you don't come back." Horth could not find the will to refuse. Kale dragged him into the open pantry. They were undressed from the waist down within seconds. For the next minute, down on the floor, they needed one another more than either seemed to need air. Kale stifled a cry. Horth climaxed in a burst of sensation so violent that he thought he was going to die. The next thing he remembered was waking up with Kale's anxious face hovering over him. "Are you all right?" she asked him, horrified. Horth wasn't sure. He shifted his body and discovered that everything worked fine. "I know you have to go," she said, and kissed him again, hard. They could easily repeat what they had just done, but he was leery of it after passing out like that, nor did he have the time. When he didn't respond, she drew back and sat up cross-legged on the floor, looking flushed and proud and unconcerned about her nakedness. "That was amazing," said Kale. Horth grinned at her in answer. Then he scrambled up and left the pantry. He was barely in time to avoid discovery by April, who led the charge of women bustling out to put rations together for their menfolk. Kale hadn't made it out of the pantry, but there was nothing Horth could do about it. With luck, April and the others wouldn't need anything from there to complete their task. 10 minutes later, Horth was suited up in flight leathers and waiting beside Arn's shuttle on the runway where he had first landed on San Home. Hill was the last to report. "The wife," he said with a sheepish grin as he took his seat beside Horth. They achieved orbit without incident, each man absorbed with his own thoughts. Everything was ready for them at the orbital station, where they separated to get into their spherical rail fighters. Horth strapped in and pored over all the controls with a feverish excitement. The nerve cloth lining of the inner hull rippled with an unblemished gray glow when Horth tested it, revealing no dead patches. He had never felt more thoroughly an adult. When the order came to launch, his ship shot from the station's rim dock like a stone from a catapult. It was good to be in space, in control of his REL fighter, on his way to do important work. They cat-clawed away from the station by drawing power through their phase splicers in tiny sips. The technique was, in fact, a bit like pulling themselves forward by digging virtual claws into space-time fabric to draw on its binding energy. 2G's acceleration was comfortable for Horth. The cat-clawing didn't take too much effort either. But he was surprised to pick up a tone, like a turning signal, over the radio. Arn and Rad signaled back. Then the Nessaks broke into song. They sang one song together, then something more complex with complementary parts. Horth was astonished, but he knew the song. He had learned it from his brothers, reliving the Nessak war in the nursery on ropes and platforms. The words called on the watching dead to help them resist Gap, explaining that although they went to take by force what could not be settled by sword law, it was a much-regretted necessary act, done to stop the spread of Okal terror. Horth joined in after Zrenal, more confident about singing memorized lyrics than he was about conversations. Sharing voices across space made Arn's fighter hand come alive with an electric unity, like a being with a shared will. It was wonderful. The feelings surged with a great swell of soul touch as they boosted into skim together. Radio transmissions were immediately left behind, but somehow their souls kept singing, sustaining the link their voices had established. Horth contributed his wordless strength and fixed determination to be worthy of the men's acceptance. Hill reacted with excitement. Even Arn and Rad seemed impressed. Only Zrenal's soul felt disgruntled, perhaps because he thought Horth was showing off, although details were impossible to pin down. Soul touch was a series of fluttering brushes against raw emotions. Horth exulted in the Nessax and his brother. He felt their bravery and their ambition, their camaraderie and willingness to take risks. In all of that, Horth was indistinguishable from them. He felt at peace with the universe and engaged in the righteous defense of its preservation. The hand ate distance, each pilot nudging up his skim factor in a game of friendly rivalry. There was no doubt that Arn was dominant, but through this stage and risky experience of martial soul touch, at an instinctive level, Arn recognized Horth as a rival and bristled. Horth made an effort to yield to Arn's will, but it backfired when he panicked at the resulting sense of losing his own grip, nearly turning a harmonious soul touch into a dangerous wake lock that would have made one of them flounder. That was the end of the soul touching. Arn shot ahead, and the rest of the hand followed. They traveled that way in an easy formation for 20 minutes, with no sign of encountering a station. Then, Zrenal peeled off and signaled Horth in Shimmer Dance to follow. Horth obeyed, wondering if the special role Zrenal had spoken about involved a flanking action. Space stations were usually built with large masses or other navigational obstacles at their backs to reduce the number of viable attack vectors, and his nerve cloth telemetry was already registering a solar system. He was confident that both he and Zrenal could fly with enough precision to work between a station and the gas giant behind it. He even felt reckless enough to risk a stray molecule of atmosphere strafing him if some escaped the sweeping action of his ship's intrusion field. Before long, he could see ward ships on his nerve cloth and primed himself to deal with their reaction once they realized he and Zrenal were part of a multi-pronged attack. 2 ward ships shot toward them, growing blue on his nerve cloth, while one fell back, turning red. But Arn, Rad, and Hill did not appear. Even more alarmingly, Zrenal cut speed and began a non-threatening approach, as if he sought to dock, not a shake-up. Horth was taken aback. It was one thing to take out the noble-born ward pilots of a liege who had dropped the shield of honor and let Arn demand the station's surrender. It was entirely another prospect to request hospitality, but Zrenal had told him to follow his lead, so he dutifully cut speed. Deceleration pressed Horth into his sling cockpit as his heart adjusted effortlessly to higher Gs. Zrenal continued to show every sign of turning their attack into a docking run. Perhaps, Horth decided, they were going to try to challenge after all. But that didn't seem too smart, given that they were here to punish dishonorable conduct. Besides, he had understood Liege Kai and her highborn relatives were off wooing their counterparts on another nearby station. Horth wondered if it was going to fall to him to duel, and resented the idea of not being warned. Or maybe their role was to deliver an ultimatum on Arn's behalf, and hope the Vrelish let them leave unmolested. That idea made Horth a bit nervous also. The lead ward ship demanded Zrenal identify himself with a bobbing signal, universal across all of Seveldom. Zrenal danced back, House of Nersal, followed by the signal for requesting dock. For a moment, there was no response. Shimmer dancing was how ships under Skim communicated with each other, using direction and the frequency of shimmer to create a pattern on another ship's nerve cloth without moving out of a relatively small patch of space. It was no good for extended conversations, and beyond the handful of simple patterns, success depended on a shared system of codes. Horth was not even sure that Eagle Nest's defenders would recognize the Nersalian pattern. Zrenal repeated it, followed by a jerk to one side that showed he was a member of the Kimp Stan. A ward ship approached to test their sincerity with soul touch. It looped around and matched speed to stroke past Horth first, and then Zrenal. Horth gritted his teeth against the Vrelish pilot's hostile doubts. He caught scintillating flashes of involuntary sexual interest from her at the discovery that he was a highborn, and could not suppress a gut-level response. But they passed the test. She signaled them to resume their approach. Zrenal behaved as primly as a demish lady as he whittled down his skimfac, cut back to cat clawing, and finally coasted into the upright catcher's mitt of a rimdock. Horth gritted his teeth against the head-popping sensation of 0G as he slid into the cup of an adjacent berth. The arm pressed his ship down as the floor sank, and within a minute, Horth was in an airlock filled with breathable air. He took his dueling sword from the place it was stowed, feeling funny about the declaration of honorable intent that is represented, and swung himself through the struts of his ship's inner hull to slide out the latch. Beyond the inner airlock, when it opened, lay a second, larger airlock. Horth strapped on his sword and stepped through. A bare-chested, relished nobleborn dressed in loose trousers and a braided vest was there to greet him, also honorably armed. He was backed by 3 stationers armed with either knives or bludgeons. It surprised Horth to see near commoners armed. The room was warm, and the locals were scantily clad. "Safe dock," the red Vrilish nobleborn greeted Horth. "I am Hark. This is Narla." He indicated the woman beside him with the tip of his shaggy head. "She's a stationer." He did not introduce the other 2 stationers, but they didn't seem to resent it. "What's your business here?" Hark asked. His grammar acknowledged Horth's superior challenge class, but not the finer gradations of birth rank that the Demish insisted on at court. "I came with Zrenal," Horth got out, matching Hark's grammar with only a mild degree of uncertainty. Hark nodded and said, "Come." The design of the station was identical to Nersalian stations. Outside the rim dock was a platform that connected it to a row of identical docks bracketed on either side by bulkheads. Below, down a steep flight of stairs, was a staging floor lined with stowed gear. An opening in the floor offered a choice of ladders or moving belts with hand and footholds for descending to the next level. The locals each selected one of the conveyor belts, and Horth did likewise. Riding down between Narla and Hark, his back prickling with an uneasy feeling of danger, Horth wondered again what Zrenal's mission was and why they had to make themselves so vulnerable. Besides, he had been looking forward to his first serious shake-up. Now, he feared he would be stuck on the station when the rest of Arn's hand attacked. It would be safe enough on the station, in general terms. It was Okal to threaten habitats like space stations with mass destruction. But Horth didn't see the point of testing their host's honor quite so rigorously, should he and Zrenal still be on the station when Arn attacked its nobleborn warders. It crossed Horth's mind that Arn may have wanted to get rid of Zrenal for some reason. He was glad to spot his brother on the promenade below, surrounded by curious stationers. The promenade was lined with cave-like quarters on either side and heavily populated. At least half of the people showed the evidence of aging that marked them as what Mother would call non-eternals, but it was otherwise hard to tell at a glance which people were nobleborns and which were near commoners. All were brightly clad in shirts, vests, and headdresses, many of them wearing scarves tied about their limbs. Children of all sizes were peppered throughout like seasoning. "Horth!" Zrenal greeted his brother in an overly animated fashion, clapping an arm on his shoulder. "You're here!" Zrenal turned back to a sword-bearing woman wearing a dirty red sash over an equally unhygienic tunic, ripe with the stale smell of body odor. "Now my brother is here, I will answer your questions," Zrenal told the woman, speaking down with full courtly deferencing, which Horth found pretentious. The woman apparently did too, because she frowned at him sourly. Horth noticed that a piece of her right nostril was missing, and the lip below it bore an old scar. She was not the only one. Most of the stationers showed evidence of fights they had survived, and all of them could use a bath, in Horth's opinion. At the same time, Horth could not help but be touched by the way the children were an accepted part of what was happening. It was a very Vrilish setting. "We wish to see Cobalt Sarn, son of Arn," Zrenal declared with a forced courage. "Nasak!" spat the woman with the notched nose, laying a hand on her sword. Hark shoved her away. "Cobalt is here," he told Zrenal. "You can see him, but we won't release him. Our liege Kai took him in when he fled here to escape some trouble with his father. He seemed happy enough to share her bed and our lives until she had a baby." Did Cobalt lay claim to the infant? Zrenal asked, showing signs of stress that were less and less understandable to Horth, given how reasonable their Vrelish hosts were proving to be. He was trying to remember what exactly Liege Kai had done to earn the condemnation of the Zerstan. He had wondered about man-rape, but even that was not Okalani, just slaw, the term for dishonorable conduct that was sexually deviant. Okal Ani sins were of a different magnitude. They threatened rebirth. Spreading disease on purpose, exterminating whole family lines, or destroying habitats were the typical examples. Horth tried hard to remember what Arn had said about Liege Kai that fitted that description. "We locked up Cobalt when he started acting like a Nessac," Hark explained, unrepentantly to Zrenal. "Getting jealous, threatening to steal Kai's baby, that sort of business. We're not sure what we'll do with him, but it was either lock him up or kill him." Horth was getting a cold, anxious feeling in his stomach. To distract himself, he scanned the wall opposite them on the promenade. Its cave-like openings were filled with things like squat tables, mattresses, and hanging bags of belongings, sitting just beyond drapes of colorful, if not necessarily clean, fabric. Shapes moved in one of the caves, almost certainly relieving sexual tensions. A pair of entirely naked children played in the mouth of another, tethered to a hook in the wall by sturdy harnesses. Other children scrambled over the rough wall, going from grip to grip and foothold to foothold in a way that reminded Horth of the rope ladder and platforms in the nursery back home in Black Hearth. "Of course," Hark was telling Zrenal, "Cobalt did get busted up a little. He took exception to Kai sleeping with a visiting Shast and tried to put a knife through him from the back. Kai broke his nose, wrist, and collarbone," Hark grinned. "I'm sure you understand. I've heard that Nersalian women are just as much real women as ours." Zrenal swallowed. He was getting angry. He was scared, too. Horth felt something. It was too subtle to say what, but the Vrelish surrounding him sensed it too. He saw a handful of the nobleborns go still or snatch a breath too suddenly. A child cried. "Nessac women are the real women," Zrenal erupted in a sudden flare of anger. Hark blinked at Zrenal's vehemence and exchanged a look with the scar-faced woman. The next moment, Horth's life went terribly wrong. The whole station quivered. Horth felt it through his feet and in his very soul. It had to be Arn, Hill, and Rad. He almost sensed them, flying in formation, sweeping in too hard for the nobleborns to stop. They were traumatizing space around the station. Horth staggered. Shrieks drowned out an alarm. Hark turned to bolt towards the lift up to the docks, but Zrenal drew his sword, his face wild with fear and determination. Horth watched in horror as his brother ran Hark through from behind. Another, harder tremor shook the station. Bags, bodies, and a shower of smaller objects tumbled out of the caves along the promenade. Narla went down shrieking, her arms waving convulsively about her head. Hark's body bunched up as he tried to rise, bleeding from Zrenal's stab, and slumped again with a groan. 3/4 of the stationers were on their knees, unconscious, or doubled over throwing up. The attack had felled the lesser Sevelites, separating them from the nobleborns on station in a way that general attire and behavior had not. Most of the nobleborns were running for the docks. Horth watched a toddler fall from a cave halfway up the wall. It seemed to take a long time. Its little body struck with the soul-sickening crunch. The nobleborn with the notched nose recovered from her shock enough to snatch a knife from a dazed stationer and hurled herself at Zrenal with the murderous cry. Zrenal could never have stopped her in time. He was wrestling another nobleborn, his sword dropped on the floor. Horth reacted without conscious thought. He body-blocked the notched-nosed woman, seizing her knife hand. As the 4 of them contended 2 by 2, another wave of skim shock hit the station. The scream of human protest was less deafening now. The air smelled of urine, the sour reek of vomit, and the metallic tang of blood. Some of the felled stationers were sobbing helplessly on the floor. Those who could were trying to assist loved ones. Somebody was wailing for Kai and the station's highborns. Arn's strategy was clear now. He was targeting the non-Eternals on the station, hoping that it had the structural integrity not to crack. Trusting, if he cared at all, that Horth and Zrenal, as highborns, would be able to hold out. But for what? Horth twisted the knife away from his opponent and hurled her into Zrenal's man. Zrenal took advantage of the break to snatch up his sword and found Horth's hand clamped over his wrist like a band of iron. "You'll get us both killed, Rejact," Zrenal yelled, hoarse with fear and excitement. But the nobleborns they had been fighting did not take the opportunity to attack. One stayed down. Notchnose decided she had better things to do and staggered off towards the lift back to the docks. Hark was on his feet again and heading there too, leaving a trail of blood. "Sarns? Are you Sarns?" A voice pierced the sounds of suffering around them as a wild-eyed woman fought her way past felled and moaning bodies towards Zrenal. "Yoli Sarn!" Zrenal called back, breaking Horth's hold with a violent wrench. "You're the Nessac defector?" he asked her excitedly. "You know where I can find Arn's son, Cobalt?" Her face was streaked in tears of terror, tears no truly Vrelish woman would be able to cry. But she was highborn. She was still on her feet, and no worse than hysterical. "The baby!" she shrilled, clutching a bundle to her chest from which a limp infant leg dangled. "The baby's in gap coma. Oh gods, he won't wake up." He and Zrenal, Horth realized with chilly reason, had docked in order to get Arn's injured son and the female defector off, and perhaps to secure the docks from inside for Arn's arrival. Horth became aware that he was very, very angry. "Where is Cobalt?" Zrenal shouted to the Nessac woman. Horth bolted for the lift up to the docks. He heard Zrenal shout after him, "What are—" and more frantically in a panic, "Horth!" The lift up to the docking floor was motionless. A nobleborn pilot had fallen trying to climb up. She lay moaning at the bottom. Horth stepped over her and climbed swiftly. The next shockwave hit when he was near the top. He heard his own voice shouting out in wordless outrage, but he did not black out and he did not stop. His whole digestive tract locked up like a clenched muscle. No one stopped him from getting into his ship. No one stopped him from launching. No one was capable. Just like one of the station's noble-born defenders, he shot clear of Eagle Nest Station, cat-clawing as hard as he dared. Without warning, Horth's soul seemed to lurch out of his body and then snap back. The nearest of the noble-born pilots ahead of him lost his grip and disappeared. It was terrible sharing the station's helplessness, blind to rail-skimming attackers without nerve cloth telemetry that he could pick up only under skim. But Horth could not skim until he was clear of the challenge sphere, or he would only add to the station's problems. He clawed harder, accelerating at over 9 Gs. He felt instinctively that his heart could cope. Then he was clear to boost and to skim, and his nerve cloth lit up. 3 blue spots zoomed towards him, highborn bright, coming in for another pass. Pairs of outclassed defenders targeted each highborn, and the Nessacs were forced to veer off, but they regrouped faster than the nobleborns were able to. They went after one Vrelish nobleborn and then the next, cutting them out of existence in a rehearsed shearing action. Other defenders flocked to help and broke up again as 2 of them interfered with each other and disappeared. It was not possible to bring greater numbers to bear very easily. Too many rail ships in one place dissolved space around them, drowning their pilots in gap. Horth charged up from the dark space of the station's challenge sphere looking like another new defender. But he did not stop when his skimfac hit the limits of endurance for a nobleborn. He filled the Nessac's nerve cloth in a blue blaze of anger, furious, righteous, and unstoppable. 2 attackers fell back. Horth had the momentary sensation of the third wavering in shock, and caught Hill's feelings of betrayal as the Nessac shot past. Memories of Hill's praise and affection glanced helplessly off the burning anger in Horth's heart. Arn and Rad came around, trying to catch Horth between them. On a delta patch of his nerve cloth that gave him a rear view on his forward nerve cloth, Horth saw the ward ships change formation in an attempt to engulf him and 2 oncoming Nessaks. They hadn't figured out that he was helping them. Horth dropped hard, his sling cockpit slamming around to match new definitions of up and down. His overpowered cardiovascular system kept pace with new demands. He evaded the misguided nobleborns, but Arn and Rand went after him together, closing ranks. The defenders regrouped, keeping Hill separate from Arn and Rad. Hill spotted 2 nobleborn ships making a run for it at the same time as Horth. They were pelting away, deeper into Red Reach, at a punishing pace for nobleborns. For an instant, Horth assumed they had opted to save their own lives. Then he realized they were going to fetch their highborns. Distracted, Horth caught a slap of soul touch from Arn as he thundered past, heading in Hill's direction. He feared he must have time-slipped for seconds he could not afford, because he surfaced to find everything had moved. 2 highborns were making for the dark space that concealed the station to shake it up again, killing or stunning more of those on board. The 3rd was gaining on the fleeing nobleborns. Horth could stop the run on the station, or he could stop the 3rd ship closing on the messengers. Or maybe he could do both. A surge of madness took control. He let the power that bound the universe hurl his tiny ship forward on high shimmer, keeping gap tight in comparison but still too wide for long-term survival. Heart straining to keep blood in his brain, he flung himself between Rad and Arn, driving them wide apart. Nobleborn defenders went after each of them. It would not be enough to take the highborns out, but it was enough to hold them off. Horth shot off in the opposite direction after Arn. The fleeing nobleborn split up. Good tactics when up against a single ship that was more powerful. The Nessak attacker went for one like a dog snapping at a fleeing grabbit. The 2nd Red Relish nobleborn probably expected Horth to go after him. But Horth went for the Nessak instead, too late to stop him from swamping the 1st grabbit, but in time to stop him from turning on the 2nd one. The clash of wills and soul touch jarred Horth to the core. He had expected some consciousness of guilt, or greed, or drive for dominance. He had not been prepared for Arn's blazing self-righteousness, fierce enough to match Horth's own. Only belief in the watching dead sustained Horth in the face of Arn's disgust. He knew his Nessalian ancestors agreed with him, even if the Nessak ones might not. He also knew they couldn't help him right now. Arn peeled away, heading for the nobleborn signal ship going to call Eagle Nest's highborns home. Horth took off after him and cut him off. Then he realized he was really in trouble, because the other 2 Nessaks had followed him out, away from the station. They must have decided that it would be easier to finish the job back at Eagle Nest after reducing his ship to a navigational hazard by shattering it into hull steel dust. Horth did not wait to find out. He picked the pilot who felt weakest and attacked. Hill's surprise as his grip failed him penetrated where anger had not. But Horth had no time for regrets now. He had seconds to prepare for Rad and Arn. Horth threw his gap wide, making him disappear. It was not a move many pilots would risk, since simple death was preferable to becoming soul lost. Horth simply felt his grip was strong enough. When he reappeared a quantum leap to one side, he knew he had time slipped longer than before, but did not know by how much. The uncertainty felt like going blind, because timing mattered so much in a shakeup. Getting his bearings, he saw that the battle had shifted away from the point where he had vanished, and the deployment of ships around his position looked all wrong. With a jolt of recognition, he also realized there were Vrelish reinforcements in the fray now, and his nerve cloth was streaked with sharp intensities of color that screamed highborn. Before he could get properly reoriented, someone noticed him too. 3 of the new highborn ships came for him, shifting their formation with an instinct for not fouling each other that most Nersalian pilots had to train to master. People said Red Vrelish nobleborns were born knowing how, and he did not think the Red Vrelish were in a mood to discriminate friend from foe. For a moment, Horth considered dropping out of Skim and taking his chances at getting shaken out of existence while he waited, blind and becalmed. But in the end, the idea was too unnerving. He slammed his cockpit around and poured on skim facts. It immediately felt like an error. All 3 Vrelish gained on him steadily. They shot wide past the sun and its few bulky planets that registered on his nerve cloth as obstacles. They were well clear of Eagle Nest Station by now, but Horth's pursuers did not let up. They shot off across Red Reach, together. Horth stuck to the route he had traveled on the way to San Home. He didn't know Red Reach well enough to risk leaving established space lanes. The harder the vacuum, the better. When manifesting in it many times a second and flying through a dust field that could splatter a pilot on his own inner hull. Even in hard vacuum, shimmer caused internal bleeding at the cellular level, but he knew those effects could be endured for hours, and it was going to take hours to cross Red Reach from one gate to the other. Horth's other choice was to head for the gate to Alliance Reach, but that never occurred to him. He knew the jump, and might have expected help from the highborn ward ships guarding it on the other side, but he instinctively shied away from the idea of leading a trio of murderous Red Vrelish into House Nersal's industrial heartland. Besides, it was to killing Reach that exiles went, and surely, Horth thought, he was nothing but a renegade now. He had killed Hill, and he had no idea what had happened to his brother. Killing Reach was not an easy place to get to, which felt right as well. To get there, he would have to pass through the Reach of Gelion, and then through Golden Reach beyond. Horth was beginning to hope he could make it, when one of his pursuers sped up. Slowly, he was pushed past 7 skim facts. Blood vessels burst in his nose, filling his mouth. His will to survive seemed to thin out. Neither he nor his pursuer could sustain this for long. Desperately, Horth cut back, and noticed with some pleasure that one of the 3 ships trailing him had dropped out. Only 2 of the Red Vrelish Highborns gave chase now, and they seemed prepared to pace themselves. His pursuers cut speed after another 10 minutes of mutual punishment, and Horth gratefully reduced his own mix to 5 skim facts. A trial of endurance followed, Horth struggling to keep ahead, pushing his skim fac up when he had to, then trimming it back whenever possible. He was conscious of nearly overdosing on Gap during the early part of the run, and adjusted his mix to stress shimmer. Blood in his lungs was a common symptom of high shimmer, but he trusted his highborn physiology to cope. He made sure he drank from the cockpit-mounted water bottle, spiked with the proteins and sugars needed for regeneration, since he had no desire to find out if he was Vrelish enough to become Relosh. He played a game with his pursuers, never going faster than necessary to keep ahead and slowing down whenever they let up. Finally, the jump into the Reach of Gelion loomed up. It glowed on the nerve cloth lining of Horth's ship in false colors. All a jump was, in reality, was a place where the binding energy of the universe was thin enough to let a ship fall between reaches if it opened itself up to a big dose of Gap. Skim-dependent telemetry could detect the thinness. The glow was an arbitrary choice of how to paint the result onto nerve cloth. Stations lined the way before Horth, labeled by signals he picked up from continuously broadcasting beacons. No lightspeed signal could reach a Rel ship in real time, of course, but many of the stations had been broadcasting for hundreds of years, littering space with signals Horth's ship could sample during its in-phase manifestations. Mobile battle wheels showed up as tiny, nameless lumps. There was no point in a battle wheel declaring its identity by beacon, unless it planned to stay in one place for a long time. Every station buzzed with the complement of ward ships, there to guard their vulnerable habitats from Rel ships flying at them like maniacs. The ships exactly like Horth's and his 2 Vrelish pursuers, in fact. They attracted ward ships like magnets as they sped past. So long as they kept going, however, the warders let them pass. The attention seemed to sober up one of Horth's escorts, who fell back to flash a dance to the other one. Horth caught the gist of the shimmer dance on a delta patch of his nerve cloth. To Horth's delight, what he read in the shimmer dance was an order to break off pursuit. He was less impressed when it was utterly ignored. His first reaction as an Ursalian was something along the lines of, He can't do that. Nersalians took orders in a shake-up. Pure Vrelish were notorious for doing what they wanted to do, and this one apparently wanted to destroy Horth. Horth and his stubborn pursuer took the jump seconds apart. A blazing forest sprang upon Horth's consciousness, challenging him to find his way through. He emerged feeling singed by the experience, the pleasant memories of childhood sharpened to a deadly edge by the pressure of the wild soul in pursuit. On the far side, Horth dodged saner traffic, picking up wardships alarmed by the recklessness of his arrival. He and his pursuer were warded all the way along the populated space lane leading from the jump towards Gillian. Horth headed for the jump to Golden Reach, beyond the turn that would have taken him to Gillian. His angry pursuer kept up. As they approached the jump, a Demish battle wheel sent out a fighter hand. Horth's pursuer gave up all at once. He peeled up, cutting Skimfac, and shimmered his willingness to back off. Horth flew on, darting through the golden Demish formation of slow-flying highborns with his heart in his throat. He plunged through the jump into Golden Reach, escorted by 3 of the Goldens. This jump was one he knew less well than others. He felt himself bombarded with words falling out of heavy books. He heard the babble of Demish receptions on Fountain Court and saw girls and boys in fussy Demish clothing fishing trinkets from a fountain. Then he was through. Horth gasped with relief at the transition. His brain hurt. He felt half numb. But his golden Demish escort had stuck close. Unable to stop now for the sake of pure momentum, Horth endured their soul touch as they swept past. They believed he was a mad Vrelish criminal, run out of Red Reach to make his way into the Badlands of the Empire where he belonged. He must have felt exactly like that to the Demish, under soul touch. They escorted him all the way across Golden Reach, and, when he hesitated, unsure of how to make the jump to Killing Reach, plunged through it with him to deliver him like baggage on the other side. Horth experienced this last jump like a plunge from a great height onto a cold gray floor. When he came to himself in Killing Reach, he was drifting, in normal space, alone. The bad feeling of 0G made his head pound. He cut back into skim once more and calmed down, but he knew he had to stop as soon as he could. He was exhausted, probably irrational, bleeding internally, and dazed from too much soul touch and gap exposure. But Horth had never been in Killing Reach before. He had no idea which way was safe to fly. He only knew that he had to find Doc soon, or one way or the other, he was going to die. When 2 wardships reared up before him, dancing the familiar codes for House of Nersal, he danced back a request for sanctuary in their home dock. Less than an hour later, Horth landed with a stagger on the floor of a Nersalian airlock. He held the middle of his dueling sword tightly in his left hand and shook his head. The head shake made things worse. He did not realize he had been overbalanced until one knee hit the floor with a painful jolt. His response was to drive himself up again and find his balance. A couple of blinks improved his vision. His nose oozed blood. So did his eyes and lungs. His shirt, beneath his flight leathers, was rank with perspiration. Every muscle ached, and his mind was rubbed raw. He flexed to prove his limbs were still his to command, then slowly and deliberately began to strap on his dueling sword. A woman watched. She wore a sword herself, which was a good sign. It said that she would not indulge in a dishonorable attack. Her chest braid declared her an Im-Shah under Liege Brillet's command. But her face had a clenched look of hatred, too intense to be anything but personal. She addressed Horth in an angry bark that struck Horth's ears as nothing more than sounds. He understood her well enough, however, when she drew her sword. He cleared his own with fatalistic calm. Another voice bellowed. "Cinca, halt!" Horth blinked, and looked through bloodshot eyes at a second woman. Tash, Liege of Brillet, strode across the docking bay floor to strike down Cinca's sword with her own, rattling off more angry words that Horth could not decode. He could make out no more than a reference to travel respite. Then he passed out. Horth woke 26 hours later to the worst post-flight hangover of his life. Someone was slapping him. He snatched at the offending hand with a snarl, but could not sustain his anger and slumped back. Whoever it was braced him in her arms and poured pilot's nectar down his throat. "Well, well, young liege son," said Tash Brillet. "We thought we might have lost you. Welcome back." She rubbed his throat and ordered, "Swallow." He obeyed, opened his eyes, and blinked at the wholesome features of the large, confident woman holding him in her arms. After that, he slept again. The next time he woke up, Brillet was sleeping, naked, in the bed beside him with her arm thrown across his stomach. Horth sat up. Brillet propped herself up on an elbow. "Feeling better?" she asked. Horth just stared at her. "I've let Hanks know I got you," she said, with a broad smile. He approved of the sleeping arrangements. Horth felt his brow furrow, trying to grasp what she meant. She explained by leaning towards him with unmistakably amorous intentions. "Let's see if you're up to your father's standard," she remarked. It was unfair, Horth thought, to apply that test while he was convalescent. But at least he understood what he was doing in Liege Brillet's bed. Horth was, in Vrellish fashion, taking over a family obligation. It was something of a coup for him, in fact, since Hanks had offered Brillet nephews before now, who were turned down. Horth was honored. He accepted the role with characteristic fearlessness, even though he did not count his performance as more than barely adequate the first time. He made up for it by the time his 3-day travel respite had passed. Brillet was a perfect match for his straightforward sexual appetite, quickly roused and easily satisfied. What he lacked in experience, he made up for in stamina, which any woman as Vrellish as Brillet appreciated in a man. On the middle of the 3rd day, Brillet returned to her quarters from a shift on the bridge, looking troubled, to find Horth working out on her exercise floor. He was doing a routine Hara had taught him for warming up. Brillet unbuckled her sword and sat down to watch. Moments later, a nobleborn came to lay out a plate of food. Fleet officers used the most Savalite orderlies they could because it was too punishing for commoners to work on a skim-capable battle wheel for very long. "I'll be sorry if she kills you," Brillet told Horth when the orderly had gone. Horth finished the set of movements he was already committed to, stopped, and turned around. He was naked from the waist up and sweating. His skin prickled with the implication he was going to have a duel. Brillet tossed him a towel. "Who?" asked Horth. "Sinka," said Brillet. "The Shah you met when you first arrived." Horth sorted through what little he had learned about Sinka. But all he knew was that she was the captain of the battle wheel they were on, and it was clear to him that the 2 women were Borello. "Why?" Horth asked. "Because you are Beryl's son," said Brillet. She took a gulp of strained fruit juice and wiped her mouth on a plain square of towel. "Because of Vren, most of all, that's the heart of it." She frowned. "Who is Vren?" Horth wanted to know. "One of your half-sibs on your father's side," said Brillet. "And my son." She settled her robust body back in her chair to get comfortable. Sinka taught Vren how to use a sword and bore his freedom price. She was Vren's mentor in Mekanst. She never speaks of him now except to challenge any Nessac she gets a half chance to take down. "I am not a Nessac," said Horth. He had shut himself off from his Nursal relatives when he turned on Arn's raiders back in Red Reach. "You don't have to be a Nessac," said Brillet. "You just have to be your mother's son." She leaned forward with an elbow on the table, pushing back the dinner tray. "Vren became my heir during the Nessac War. He had grown up fast, highborns did then. He was a Rel man. Not only an uncanny Rel Shah, but a leader, and good with his sword. He did not want peace with the Nessacs on the terms they offered. He objected to Hank's marriage. They argued, but Hank stood by his decision. Vren challenged your father. His father too, of course, but Hanks did not raise his gift children the way he raised you and your brothers. In those days, he still acted like a proper Vrelish man. But he respected Vren's contribution in the war, and he respected the fact he was my son. That duel was bitterly hard for me to watch. I was Hank's heir, Vren was mine. I told them I would champion neither one against the other. They would have to settle it themselves, by the sword. Brillet paused, but did not look away or by any other gesture suggest she wished to shy from the facts. Instead, she said starkly, Hanks won. But he did not kill Vren, Brillet followed up. Perhaps he should have. Vren chose to accept treatment from the Monatees and survived. Sinka, for one, would have coped better if Vren had died. But he didn't die. He merely lost the courage to duel and turned pirate, here in Killing Reach. Vren became no better than one of those Killing Reach Rishans, prepared to stop at nothing and respecting no law. If he had died instead, he might have been reborn again cleanly by now. Brillet selected a strip of dried beef, coated in a sugary paste with a nutty base, took a bite, and waited until she had chewed it thoroughly and swallowed before going on. I must respect Sinka's challenge. If you wish to live here on this station, it is her right. If you don't, you may leave now. Horth thought about it. He decided there would always be some kind of challenge from someone who did not think he belonged. He felt a little shaky about it, since Sinka was much older than him and a battle wheel captain. But he felt too lonely to give up what he had found with Brillet either. He concluded that he may as well face Sinka's challenge, here and now. He said, I will fight. Akrel, then, said Brillet with a smile. We'll make a night of it tonight, but see you get the sleep you need, too. Horth faced Sinka the next morning on the docking floor where he had first landed. The location was her choice, to symbolize her refusal to accept him as crew. They squared off, each dressed in light clothes with their heads exposed. Brillet stood for both combatants as their judge of honor. About 30 other witnesses were able to squeeze into the room, including half a dozen members of the Kimp Stan. Whatever happened, there would be reliable reports and stories told. Sinka's face had the cool, intent look of an experienced duelist. She waited for Horth to attack, expecting him to show impatience. The silence in the room was oddly peaceful. Sinka edged sideways, threatening obliquely. Horth mirrored her. They engaged, beating each other's blades, but Horth would not attack. She had challenged him. He would wait for her to show her temper. When she did go for him, it was with a controlled and modest test of his defenses. He parried effortlessly, and they both backed off, watching and assessing each other. Sinka was left-handed like Horth, which was typical for Vrelish Sevelites. She exposed her right side a little, but Horth ignored the invitation. Her lips pressed hard against each other. The next second, she attacked in earnest. A quick exchange followed. Horth easily parried, but Sinka stepped in on his riposte, forcing their blades to lock at the bottom third. Horth swung his sword arm out, pushing her blade away, and they sprang apart once more. They circled in silence, sword tips testing each other's nerve by jabbing in and out tauntingly, never committing. Then, she lunged for his heart. Horth parried in a downward arc, but Sinka's point didn't quite clear his nearest thigh, grazing him almost by accident even as Horth whipped his own blade back and up around to pierce her forearm. She grunted and wrenched her arm back, off his tip. Hold! Shouted Brillet, and half a dozen highborns intervened to break them up before they could regroup to go on. Brillet looked from Sinka to Horth and back. Then she said to Sinka, He is better able to fight with the scratch than you are with that arm. But you took first blood. She waited to be sure she had her friend's attention before adding, Be satisfied. Sinka glared at Brillet, clutching her bleeding sword arm in her right hand. Then she looked at Horth as he waited, and said, Akrel then. Let him be one of us.